introduce you to Stephen Williams, who I like to call my friend, but it isn't mutual.
Fully mutual, David.
We often used to meet at Tyndale House when he would make the trek from Ireland to come and renew his researches in biblical studies, but really he's a theologian. In other words, he understands all those words that I can't get my head round, and by which we understand who God is. So this morning we were looking at AI from the point of view of the machines and seeing if they're going to ever have emotions or ever going to have relationships with us. Now we're looking at it from the other point of view, looking at the humans. Yes, Stephen is not representing God, he is representing us as humans, theologians trying to understand God as we look at the machines and try and figure out what that relationship is going to be. Stephen took the right road. He left Oxford to go to Cambridge. He sort of just visit Cambridge really, because then you went to Yale, and then went up to Aberystwyth, a wonderful place, and then went to Belfast, and that of course is Queen's College, so you can't get up any higher than that. He often makes a trip across the ocean, across that very choppy water between that island and ours, and he's kept in touch and developed this understanding of theology and of us and God and that relationship through the various philosophers. Today we're going to hear particularly about Descartes, but you could name any philosopher and Stephen will tell you why they are important or not. But Descartes is important. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, David. And thanks for the invitation to speak in this meeting. My formal connection with Queen's University Belfast ended March 31st. So I was honorary professor of theology from 2017 to March 31st. And now I'm an ex-honorary professor of theology and many other things too, no doubt. I don't normally address the topic of AI. I regularly speak on that, but I don't normally address it from this point of view. So in order to make sure I don't omit things I want to say, I'm actually going to read from a script. It's not ideal in some ways, but that way I can be sure, I think, of not omitting anything. So AI in the shadow of Descartes. Let's see. Good. No publication has been more frequently cited in accounts of the story of AI than Alan Turing's paper, Computing Machinery and Intelligence, published in 1950, to which we heard reference this morning. In it, Turing asked whether or not we should in principle be entitled to attribute intelligence to a machine. Can machines think? Although this seems to be often overlooked, Turing touched on a question that apparently puts clear water between his day and ours, notifying his earnest scientific readership of a theological objection to the possibility of thinking machines. It is this: thinking is the function of the soul. Therefore, AI, being soulless, cannot think. Turing is not disposed to give much time of day to religion, certainly not when he's involved with science, but he takes time out in order to dismiss this objection. And this is what he says: an omnipotent God could slap a soul onto a creature such as an elephant, for example, simultaneously conferring on it a suitably mutated brain to mediate thought emanating from the soul. In that case, God omnipotent should be able to attach a soul to a machine to enable it to think. Now, in another context, we might probe the notion of divine omnipotence and created order, which Turing is assuming here. Right now, I propose to ignore this particular elephant in the room. Many Christians will spring to say that Turing confused Christian theology with Cartesian philosophy. An immaterial thinking soul operating upon a material body is, they will say, Descartes, whose dualism has long been rejected by sound theology. Now, I am not addressing the question of whether or not Descartes deserves this rejection, and I shall remain remarkably uninterested in it. I simply note that Turing's basically dismissive reference to the thinking soul seems to show that AI is precisely not in the shadow of Descartes. In fact, AI is surely well out of it. For Descartes, thought cannot be attributed to matter. In his century, that is the 17th, Locke set the cat amongst the pigeons by asking whether God could bestow on matter the capacity for thought. And before him, Hobbes had described thought as computation and computation as matter in motion, thus earning him the appellation grandfather of AI. In that same century, that genius extraordinaire Leibniz dreamed of representing thought in logico-mathematical formulae, thus earning his own appellation, the patron saint of cybernetics, the science of communication and control, whose historical and conceptual connection with AI is strong and interesting. And let's flail around our appellations. Equitably, Locke was called the intellectual ruler of the century, the 18th century, though he died right at its beginning. Anyway, if we are in quest of shadows from that century that fall over AI, they will be cast aplenty over our landscape, but surely only a defective eye will detect the shadow of Descartes in their midst. What follows in this paper is an attempt to espy Descartes on this scene with a view to Christian thought which engages with AI, profiting from what we see, profiting from the investigation of Descartes here. I shall take a long run-up and look at Descartes rather more generally in the first part of what follows, place him in a broader context in the second part, and turn to AI in a more focused way in the third. So I shall be circling around AI in an indirect approach for much of the time, but I trust it will be profitable. 1747, Julien Offray de la Métrie published his brief treatise, L'Homme-Machine, Man-Machine. Not the deepest of philosophical works, it nonetheless unmistakably made the rather revolutionary point heralded in the title. Thought is a purely material process, embedded in purely material reality. This seals the truth that the human being is a machine. Now, we might assume that Descartes was the arch enemy. Actually, he was rather an inspiration. Of course, in defending the immaterial view of mind or soul, Descartes was, says La Métrie, much deceived, as he adds, we all know. But Descartes admirably paved the way for thinkers like La Métrie, who would correct his mistake and iron out his thought. For Descartes, quote, was the first to prove completely that animals are pure machines, to which La Métrie might have added explicitly that Descartes propounded a fine mechanical view of the human body in its entirety. In other work, La Métrie seems to have drawn from Descartes here. Machine, incidentally, could apparently have a wider range of meaning for Descartes than it has normally for us, but that's not germane to what follows. All Descartes needed, La Métrie thought, for consistency and accuracy was to apply the materialist and mechanistic principle to the one exception he retained in the created order, mind. La Métrie was doing it for him. Now, in pursuit of Descartes, I've shifted from the vocabulary of soul to mind, and also used the phrase mind or soul. Scholars disagree on the interpretation of Descartes' vocabulary, that we translate from Latin and French as mind or soul. If Descartes does not treat the terms synonymously, he often treats them interchangeably. In denying that animals possess souls, Descartes was aware that vegetative, as opposed to rational souls, were standardly ascribed to animals, and his substitution of purely bodily mechanism for animal souls caused consternation. Correspondingly, Descartes explained the human body in strictly mechanistic terms. But a defense of the immateriality and immortality of the human soul, that is, of the rational soul or mind, was central to Descartes' apology against atheism, overt or covert atheism. The self, the I, is essentially an immaterial thinking substance, mind or soul. Lemaitre was taking up an issue which had exercised contemporary critics of Descartes' meditations. Descartes does not look as happy as Lemaitre looked. It's interesting, actually, because normally from that era, the pictures of people don't show them with a kind of jaunty, smiling look that Lemaitre had. He's only taking up an issue which had exercised contemporary critics of Descartes' meditations. Its second edition was published in 1642, along with 7 sets of objections, together with Descartes' own replies to those objections. Not one of his interlocutors was happy with his treatment of the relationship of mind or soul to body. I am, said Descartes, in the strict sense, only a thing that thinks. That is, I am a mind, or intelligence, or intellect, or reason. Qua thinking thing, mind, quote, is not extended in length, breadth, or height, and has no other bodily characteristics. Extension characterizes body. And, quote, I might consider the body of a man as a kind of machine. This is Descartes in Meditations, equipped with and made up of bones, nerves, muscles, veins, blood, and skin. Mind and body are not totally disconnected. We are more intimately related to our bodies than is the sailor to the ship he indwells, but they are distinct. In fact, given that body is divisible and mind indivisible, quote, the natures of mind and body are not only different, but in some way opposite. Now, in relation to this argument of Descartes, all the first respondent of the 7 could manage to say wearily on this matter was that the possibility of conceiving soul and body apart from each other did not entail the possibility of their existing apart from each other. But other criticisms converged on the question of the corporeal possibility of thought. Hobbes, believing that thought is a material process, held not only that Descartes had failed to show otherwise, but also that the logic of Descartes' argument supported his, that is, Hobbes' conclusions. Mersenne also could not see how Descartes had shown how it is impossible that the whole system of your body may combine to produce the motions which we call thoughts. Arnauld, whom Descartes respected, said that Descartes failed to get round the objection that thought, quote, appears to be attached to bodily organs. Bourdin cannot see his way through the terminological miasma, into which he also flings the word spirit, to Descartes' conclusions. The anonymous fraternity which authored the 6th set of objections apparently spoke for all Descartes' interlocutors in declaring that, quote, no one has yet been able to grasp that demonstration of yours by which you think you have proved that what you call thought cannot be a kind of corporeal motion. There is a particularly detailed critique by one of the most influential thinkers of the century, Pierre Gassendi. Gassendi wonders why Descartes cannot logically conceive of the soul in the form of a wind or a very thin vapor, diffused throughout and animating the body, or a rarefied body organized in such a way as it would make it capable of thought. Particularly focused is Gassendi's challenge that, quote, to prove that your nature is different, that is, incorporeal, as you, Descartes, maintain, to prove your nature is different, you ought to produce some operation which is of a quite different kind from those which the brutes perform, one which takes place outside the brain, or at least independently of the brain, and this you do not do. So much for Descartes' interlocutors. Descartes replies to all these objections. Now, whatever the success or otherwise of objection or reply, it is noteworthy that we encounter here a consensus that Descartes has failed to demonstrate the immateriality of thought. Given his advances in describing the mechanical functioning of the human body, it is arguable that he more paves than stands in the way of artificial intelligence. Of course, the belief that thought is corporeal does not entail the conclusion that AI can think. Plenty of materialists hold that the operation of thought requires flesh and blood. But some think that the principal threat which AI poses to the Christian view of humanity lies in its naturalistic or materialistic root presuppositions. And our early critics of Descartes certainly did not think that Descartes had booked himself a secure place on the side of the traditional angels in steering clear of those presuppositions. He certainly didn't book it with his treatise on men, which he dared not publish in his day. Because part of that work has been lost, it is not easy to get confidently into its argument, but in it Descartes majors on the description of man, his terminology, as a machine in all his bodily reality, including, of course, the brain. And particularly telling is his explicit comparison with the non-human machine. This is how he writes. One may compare the nerves of the machine I'm describing, that's the human machine, with the pipes in the works of fountains in royal gardens. Its muscles and tendons with the various devices and springs which serve to set them, that is the fountains, in motion. Its animal spirits, humans, with the water which drives them, the fountains. The heart with the source of the water, and the cavities of the brain with the storage tanks. Thus, Descartes. Now, let me move on. I trust that enough has been said there to imply that AI does not occupy a rather sunny spot infinitely removed from the shadow where Descartes is concerned. I've wanted to get a general picture right by emphasizing that Descartes was as much a mechanist as a dualist. But the theological interest which I hope to stimulate emerges from taking in a broader scene. In his contemporary classic, one has to call it that, The Master and His Emissary, The Divided Brain and the Making of the Western World, which he followed up with his monumental The Matter with Things, Ian McGilchrist has elaborated the thesis, quote, that there are two fundamentally opposed realities, two different modes of experience, that each is of ultimate importance in bringing about the recognizably human world, and that their difference is rooted in the bi-hemispheric structure of the brain. End quote. Each hemisphere gives a different type of attention to the world. More than contrast, there is tension to the point of apparently structural opposition between the hemispheres. More than structural opposition, the divisive, analytic, and calculative left hemispheric way of seeing the world has dethroned the right with its integrative, intuitive, big picture vision. Yet, the right is more closely related to the body than is the left hemisphere. The right trades in wisdom, not just in knowledge, in experience, not just in information. However, the left, which is the constitutional emissary to the right, when it is functioning properly, has usurped the master. In the West, philosophy, technology, and humankind itself are standardly viewed and approached from the perspective of the left hemisphere. Consequent intellectual distortion emanates from the functional imbalance of our bi-hemispheric brain. In his conclusion, Ian McGilchrist portrays a world frighteningly far along in the making as he poses the question, what would the left hemisphere world look like? And what that world looks like is even further along by the time he came to write his massive The Matter with Things. Specialization and technicalizing of knowledge would, in such a world, which we've got into by now, would, he says, promote the substitution of information and information gathering for knowledge, which comes through experience. The right hemisphere's broader view of the world would be unavailable to us. Bureaucracy would flourish with technology. Quote, the living would be modelled on the mechanical. McGilchrist highlights the machine. What Peter Berger and his colleagues call mechanisticity would replace the sense of what Marcel called the mystery of being. Quote, because the mechanical would be the model by which everything, including ourselves and the natural world, would be understood. People in such a society would fail to understand and order values except in terms of utility. Depersonalization would set in. The general notion of reasonableness might become unintelligible as it retreated before the standard of mechanical rationality. Tacit knowing would become discarded. All knowledge has to be explicit and formalized to count as knowledge. Awe and wonder would go. That is the world in which governmental and socio-political control would be exercised. As I said, this hypothetical world is fast phasing into actuality as far as McGilchrist is concerned. Descartes is at the heart of all this. He is the only philosopher mentioned in the introduction to The Master and His Emissary, and the first major philosopher to be introduced in the first chapter. In the course of both McGilchrist's books, criticism of Descartes abounds. Descartes is the left hemispheric philosopher who needs to see things clearly and distinctly in order to possess certainty, which he takes to be a basic human need, who regards the body as the object of contemplation by the real self, which is mind. McGilchrist's conclusion to his first volume includes 2 references to Descartes, repeating references made earlier in the work. These are chilling because they implicate the questions of madness and schizophrenia. McGilchrist draws on the work of Louis Sass, the wider ranging of the 2 works by Sass to which he refers, that's Madness and Modernism, Insanity in the Light of Modern Art, Literature and Thought. The wider range, that work came out in a second edition a few years after The Master and His Emissary, and Sass highlighted McGilchrist's work as being of particular interest. Let me pause with it for a moment before returning to McGilchrist's 2 references to Descartes. This is what Sass says. What if madness, in at least some of its forms, were to derive from the heightening rather than a dimming of conscious awareness, and an alienation not from reason but from the emotions, instincts, and the living body? This, in essence, is the basic thesis of this book. This book, says Sass, whose study is centered on schizophrenia, the quintessential form of madness. Modernism exhibits some cardinal features of the schizophrenic condition, although Sass posits affinities between schizophrenia and modernism, not causal connections. He allows for a variety of causal possibilities. Descartes puts in an early appearance in the introduction because Sass's findings will go in the opposite direction of Cartesian philosophy. Once, says Sass, human consciousness came to be defined by the self-awareness of its mental essence, as in Descartes' cogito ergo sum. It seemed especially evident that madness must be understood as a deviation from the rationality which this state of affairs constituted. That is, once you think as Descartes thinks, thought and madness must somehow be profoundly antithetical, says Sass. But in fact, the Cartesian vision has its own dangerous affinities with madness. It disconnects the essential knowing self from the world of flesh and blood and its interactions. The self is disengaged. Its knowledge is a private knowledge. Its world is detached from the external world which it surveys. Sass' detailed accounts of schizophrenia illustrate the parallel, and modernism exhibits the parallel. So now, McGilchrist draws on this. I've quoted from the second edition, back to McGilchrist. Descartes' self, unearthed in the cogito ergo sum, is the left hemispheric self. The first of McGilchrist's two citations of Descartes in the conclusion picks up an observation which Descartes makes in his Discourse on Method. After a fateful philosophical day, shut up in a stove-heated room, Descartes set out on travels, and to quote him, that is Descartes, throughout the following 9 years I did nothing but roam about the world trying to be a spectator rather than an actor in all the comedies played out there. Second reference to Descartes is to a remark he makes in his Meditations. If I look out of the window and see men crossing the square, as I just happen to have done, I normally say that I see men themselves, yet do I see any more than hats and coats, which conceal automatons? I judge that they are men. Men, again, Descartes' language. McGilchrist's earlier discussion of all this was rather dramatic. It takes place under the heading Descartes and Madness. McGilchrist notes that Descartes' allusion in the Meditations to madmen who trust their senses. He notes that allusion, Descartes then proceeds to describe symptoms which occur in schizophrenia. However, schizophrenia, says McGilchrist, is about unreasonably mistrusting the senses. Think about what Descartes sees out of the window. McGilchrist quotes David Levin, quote, "What could be a greater symptom of madness than to look out of one's window and see what might, for all one knows, be machines, instead of real people?" McGilchrist discusses this passage under the title Zombies in his later work. Yet all this is rational by Descartes' standards. And before we consider mounting a defense of Descartes on this point, we are swept on to Descartes' observation, quoted by McGilchrist, that there is, this is Descartes, absolutely no connection that I can understand between that curious tugging in the stomach, which I call hunger, and the desire to eat. You can't see the connection between the tugging in the stomach, which I call hunger, and the desire to eat. And Descartes wonders what explains the fact that the curious sensation of pain gives rise to a particular distress of mind. Sensation of pain gives rise to distress of mind. What, says Descartes, is the connection here? Now, McGilchrist says this seems to be to display a quite extraordinary lack of intuitive understanding. If there is one place at which the relationship between the body and subjective experience can be intuitively understood, it is right here, in sensations such as pain and hunger. But, says McGilchrist, Descartes was not sure that he had a body at all. But in truth, reason is rooted in the body. Descartes' reason apparently is not. Against this background, McGilchrist interprets as akin to madness Descartes' other statement that he's a spectator of the world, a statement subject to further commentary in his McGilchrist's later work. In that later work, The Matter with Things, McGilchrist observes first that Descartes had many hallmarks of the schizoid personality. And then McGilchrist says Descartes displayed an essentially schizoid personality. Now, how does all this bear on AI? Well, it identifies the operative notion of intelligence in AI as a left hemispheric view of intelligence in the tradition of Descartes. McGilchrist favorably quotes Stephen Toulmin in Cosmopolis. This is the quotation from Toulmin. "The ideas of strict rationality, modelled on formal logic, and of a universal method for developing new ideas in any field of natural science were adopted in the 1920s, 1930s with even greater enthusiasm and in even more extreme form than had been the case in the mid-17th century. The Vienna Circle program was even more formal, exact and rigorous than those of Descartes or Leibniz." Amongst the members of the Vienna Circle, whom Toulmin mentions in immediate connection with Descartes, are Rudolf Carnap. Far and away the most widely used textbook on artificial intelligence is Stuart Russell and Peter Norvig, AI, a modern approach, now in its 4th edition. A massive book. And discussing the foundations of artificial intelligence, the authors, after referring to the Vienna Circle, describe Carnap's book, The Logical Structure of the World, 1928, as perhaps the first theory of mind as a computational process. Now, I can't pretend to be familiar with or to understand well enough the set of logical issues which occupy Carnap. I struggled with the work, I've read through it, but parts I can't follow. But it is not difficult to read in that work a philosophy well suited to AI at its origins, in the years that led up to the famous Dartmouth Conference in 1956, when the term AI made its public splash. Of course, AI has moved along a lot since then, and it is important to know that, but I'm not following that story. Rather, I'm asking, how should we respond as Christians to my account up to this point? Intelligence, therefore, in AI, here being understood as an essentially left hemispheric view of intelligence, and that's the connection with Descartes. This is my final part now. I shall not revisit the question of dualism, familiar as that is. For my purposes, McGilchrist's interpretation of left hemispheric dominance, in which AI participates, is what is of interest. Theology obviously does not enshrine neuroscientific commitments which allow it to adjudicate on matters of hemispheric lateralization. Theology can but call on McGilchrist as a neuroscientific witness to what it is bound to say, namely that the supposition that AI resembles human intelligence is based on a radically faulty view of human intelligence. Now, I underline this. There's a wide variety of views on the comparative nature of human and machine intelligence in the AI community. And that connection to human intelligence is only one view out there. And in any case, we'll have to spell out what people mean when they hold the view that there is some comparison between human and AI intelligence. It's rather lazy to speak of it simply resembling. So I'm not talking about all AI or any such thing, of course. Christians believe that human intelligence is basically religious. That is, it is the intelligence of beings in the image of God, as we heard this morning, and thus wired to love of God and neighbour, and to dominion over creation in that context. AI is not so wired. The mechanisms of the brain are wired by the Creator into a body designed for the love and service of God, and an intelligence otherwise engineered bears no fundamental resemblance to the human, even though it may function, of course, in overlapping ways. According to McGilchrist's analysis, engineered intelligence is a left hemispheric project whose error grows in proportion to an assumption that some make in that world that its mechanism of AI, is assimilated to human intelligence. If human intelligence is religiously wired, on a theological account, to be religiously wired is to be ecclesially wired to churchmen, church personship. Since the community of the church is the sphere to which the religious mind is ultimately ordered by its creator. In making this statement, I'm admittedly taking a shortcut, but interpersonal neurobiology, with Dan Siegel, clinical professor of psychiatry at UCLA, at its head, demonstrates that the proposition about humans being ecclesially wired is not scientifically preposterous. Not only does Siegel's work undermine the notion that a disembodied brain, disembodied in terms of our flesh and blood, can remotely resemble human intelligence, he lays out the evidence for the brain functioning in vital connection with the rest of our flesh, further giving a scientific account of its essential formation in relationships with people and the planet. Theologians are as little qualified to assess the interpersonal neurobiology of Dan Siegel as they are the neuroscience of Ian McGilchrist. But it is hard not to see in Siegel's work a scientific rendering of foundational theological ecclesiology. The detail of Siegel's work of which I've only read a part, is extremely interesting. The connection of body, the rest of the body with brain, and the connection of brain with relationships and environment as integral to the way intelligence functions, not just contingent, but integral. I have not left Descartes behind. In what is widely regarded as the founding document of modern philosophy, the Discourse on Method, Descartes makes preliminary remarks whose theological significance have, as far as I can tell, been neglected. There, Descartes gives us a personal account of how he prosecuted his philosophical enterprise. Dissatisfied with his intellectual training, Descartes appointed reason to be his guide in a long search for truth, which famously proceeded by razing to the ground any philosophical edifice not built on the presumption of universal doubt. Now, Descartes reminds us, while a house is being rebuilt, its occupant must live somewhere. Accordingly, he himself resolved to live by a provisional moral code suited to a place where you can live comfortably while building his own philosophical construction is in process. Comfort matters. Now, the first rule, he says, in the code he devised for the maximization of happiness while he was engaged in a philosophical project which might take a long time. First rule in the code he devised for the maximization of happiness is to obey, I quote him here, obey the laws and customs of my country, holding constantly to the religion in which by God's grace I had been instructed from my childhood. Well, Descartes was nurtured in the faith of the Catholic Church. The code inculcated into him from childhood, moulding the laws and customs of his country, as well as his personal being, should have been that the human individual is constituted precisely as an embodied being in relationship fulfilled in love. A code that should have been transmitted by example, not just by precept. Had it been transmitted, Descartes should have experienced as existential reality the truth that humans are destined not for individual self-possession, but for relationships, again as we heard this morning, and love. Provisionally, he should have abided by that code while he went in search of philosophical truth. Hypothetically, had this happened, his subsequent philosophizing might, of course, have torn down this temporary ecclesial abode and provisional religious scheme. As it is, his subsequent philosophizing apparently did not have to reckon with relational embodiment in his provisional code. Well did Nietzsche observe that every philosophy is a biography of the soul. If AI is in the shadow of Descartes, one reason for that is that Cartesian philosophy was apparently not in the shadow of a wholesome ecclesial experience. But if I introduced Gilchrist on madness, I cannot dodge it now. Perhaps it is a moot point what theology can contribute, or whether theology can contribute to clinical accounts of madness, but it is no deviation to haul in the question of spiritual insanity. The project to build the Tower of Babel in the land of Shinar was born of two parents, a worry and an ambition. A worry that humankind should be dispersed, and the ambition that it should make a name for itself. I'm simply there reproducing the text of Genesis. Anxiety and the desire for fame are, it has been rightly said, I think, the basic forces of what we call culture. A well-respected commentator theologically whirls away from the mindset that plunders Genesis naively in order to map it automatically onto the modern world. A commentator like that remarked that, quote, that the building of a massive structure that presumes definite technical discoveries and mathematical skills, as well as the common will of a group of people who think it necessary to build this building, that in essence anticipates the possibility of a development that would be realized only in the technical age, in a way that would affect the whole of humanity. I now realize I should have put that quotation up. But so I'll simply repeat it to get the essence of it. The building of a massive structure that presumes definite technical discoveries and mathematical skills, plus the common will of a group of people, essentially anticipates the possibility of a development realized only in the technical age. That's a commentator, a non-conservative commentator. There are a number of verbal parallels in Hebrew between the Babel account and the second and third chapters of Genesis, which recount the story of Adam and Eve. And David, please don't ask me what those parallels, Hebrew parallels are. The story of the fall is a story of illusion. Nothing was amiss in Eve's perception that the tree of the knowledge of good and evil was good for food and delight to the eyes. She wasn't wrong to see that. But illusion did set in when she saw, in inverted commas, that its fruit was to be desired to make her flourish in wisdom. It was not so desirable. She thought she saw that. Now in human life, sustained illusions are sometimes forms of insanity. That's the connection, of course, with Descartes of a certain kind. The story of Genesis 1 to 11 is the story of dominion gone awry, culminating in the edifice of Babel. Should we not think of Babel as the social, collective, and public expression of the personal and individual insanity which afflicted the parents of the human race? I'm just tracking the Genesis story here, whatever we make of genre and hermeneutics, just the story. If McGilchrist is right, there is a touch of madness in the story of AI. Robert Garetsky wrote a book on apocalyptic AI, where he described it as the ultimate form of transhumanism to which reference was made this morning. That is, the philosophy that promotes the technological enhancement of humans to the point where a new species emerges, if we retain the language of species. Now, obviously, I want to underline this, we're excluding much of what happens in AI if we talk in these terms. I am thinking of AGI, artificial general intelligence, or strong AI, and maybe even artificial superintelligence. I am therefore restricting my treatment of AI. I take the points made this morning about the problem with the definition of AI, different understandings of it. But where there's an impetus towards what we might describe as the maximization of an artificial intelligence whose constitution is devised with no reference to a creator, and where it's tacitly, if not explicitly, aligned with a transhumanist mentality, then a madness of human spirit in that case is surely abroad. I'm drawing to conclusion. The dangers of mapping AI onto a biblical account of Babel are too obvious to mention. Not just the varieties, but also the gains of AI cannot be denied, and equally are too obvious to mention. But where something akin to human intelligence is detected in AI, we seem to be reversing Descartes' gaze, but retaining all the perceptual difficulties that attended his gaze. That is, where Descartes saw human beings, but thought he saw only automata, we see automata, but think we see human intelligence. This is neither to subscribe to or reject the connection between Descartes and madness made by McGilchrist and others. Nor in terms of intellectual history am I picking out the shadow of Descartes over AI as the most significant modern thought. Nor in terms of history am I picking out intellectual history as the most significant form of history, as though it were more significant than social or economic, in whose shadow lies AI. But if AI is largely a left hemisphere project, the story of thought driven by the left hemisphere perspective craves our theological attention. And it's hard to think of a modern figure more important than Descartes in this connection, even if others turn out to be equally important. A theology which usefully grapples with AI must thus be prepared to grapple with Descartes too, and not just by rehearsing the question of dualism. After Buddha was dead, said Nietzsche, they still showed his shadow in a cave for centuries, a tremendous, gruesome shadow. Nietzsche proclaimed that God was dead, that is, intellectually a spent and thoroughly discredited force. But, said Nietzsche, his shadow lingers in the form of Christian morality. Descartes is dead, at least his body is, but we have to reckon with the claim that his shadow remains in the form of a left hemispheric philosophy that has shaped a significant segment of Western intellectual culture. If that claim is warranted, AI is surely in that shadow. We vanquish it only when theological thought is embedded in the life of the church, embodied life, revealing humanity, embodied humanity, as the bearer of the intelligence designed for earthly dominion, the intelligence of human creatures made, redeemed, and renewed in the image of God. Thank you for your patience on a warmish afternoon.
Thank you, Stephen, for that paper. And now, any questions? Well, in the answer, then I get to ask my question. I'm intrigued that this comparison, which you say is an old one, between AI and Babel, especially as AI is so good at translating different languages now, that it really isn't anti-Babel. But if AI really is a form of madness, in that it's a schizophrenic dislocation from reality, can be seen in the same sort of discussion as Descartes, that's a very pessimistic view. Don't you have anything optimistic to say about AI?
No, at the end there, perhaps all too casually, I said that the gains of AI cannot be doubted, and they're obvious. So I stand by that very, very much, and also the varieties of AI. So I can give several examples, but I guess we all can, of the gains of AI. Think of it, for example, in diagnosis, in healthcare, just as one example springing immediately to mind. Not to mention the way in which it processes information, that is information processing, of course, which we might say is not strictly thinking, but nevertheless, huge gains there. And I accept the variety of things which go under AI. But I suppose, David, I'm struck by this, that when you read people writing on AI, and there's a great variety of stuff being written, many of them who are central in the field will talk about the ambition since the Dartmouth Conference in 1956 to devise intelligence which is human-level intelligence. And it seeks to get as close as possible, some of it seeks to get as close as possible to human intelligence. Now, to do that, you have to have a view of what human intelligence is, and that view is often detached from carbon, flesh and blood. I have occasionally used in a PowerPoint presentation, I have juxtaposed images, first of two chess players, one is human and the other is robotic. Because in AI circles very often chess is the sort of sign or model of intelligence. And then I show a picture of presumably a mother trying to comfort a 3-year-old child, which is emotional intelligence. I ask myself which intelligence is more important. And you then realize that when you're looking at a lot of AI, emotional intelligence is not what's being talked about first and foremost. Intelligence is being conceived rather narrowly. Now, it does seem then to be, taken to an extreme, that seems to be a kind of illusion about humans, illusions about intelligence. And that's where the story of Babel comes into me, that Genesis 1 to 11 I read as a description of things getting worse and worse and worse. And Babel culminates the whole thing after the garden. It seems to me to be wrong to neglect at least that strand in the history of AI. No doubt dangers about it being too pessimistic. I confess I am pretty pessimistic for other reasons too, though. The use of AI, for example, in warfare and other things, and other things too. But I have that concern, yes, and pessimism. Yeah.
Would anyone like to stand up for AI? David.
I suppose that, yeah, my question is slightly along similar lines of sort of a pessimism, optimism sort of question, really. And you made 4 really good points about intelligence, or true intelligence, being essentially religious, if I heard you right. One being tied to love of God and neighbour, wired into the body.
Yes.
To actually output that inner desire interaction.
Yes.
To be ecclesially wired, and then to be ordered by the creator.
Yeah.
It seems to me as AI has developed, I mean, a lot of people use a sort of example of a runaway train, but sort of AI is this runaway train that's taking us to a destination that we can't really control. But and alongside that analogy, you could say, well, we're actually building the tracks as well. So, and Peter referred to, attempts to regulate and sort of put some directionality to the direction of travel. When I sort of think about, sorry, this is a long question, so more a comment before the question. As I think about your four elements of true intelligence, I think of wired into the body, but potentially is overcomable with the advances in robotics and sort of input mechanisms into artificial intelligence. And obviously, when artificial intelligence remains in a sort of a device, obviously that's a problem, but when it becomes integrated into cybernetics and robotics, then that perhaps becomes less essential. And ordered by his creator, ordered by God, you could say, well, we substitute the word God with the word creator, we could say, well, we are the creator of this machine, and perhaps that objection can be overcome to some extent as well. It seems to me that the big question there is the question of love. You're saying that it's tied to love of God and tied to the love of our neighbour, and that's really where it all hangs, really, and it seems to fit really closely with what Peter said about lack of empathy. But lack of empathy and sort of the motivation of love is the problem, that machines can't have that kind of emotional intelligence. And I suppose my question then, finally getting to it, is the omission of those things, of genuine emotion, lack of empathy, and motivation and love, are these irredeemable problems for the ethics of AI? Or do you think there is a sort of a track that we can take the train down where those things can be addressed and redeemed? Can we move that left hemispheric mechanism and sort of bring in some higher form of intelligence into AI?
I certainly yield to others on many aspects of AI. I'm not technologically knowledgeable about it. But I think if that cannot be wired into AI, then it is not redeemable as long as it is thought of as in some kind of parallel human intelligence. If it is thought of as something which is designed for a task, for certain tasks, so making no pretension to the possibility of possessing those qualities and not calling it anything like human intelligence, then it could be redeemable as any instrument might be. But while it is given the status of intelligence on the presumption that there's something human level about it, then I don't see how it's redeemable if these things cannot be wired into it.
Cautious.
Sorry, very elementary question. Could you right back to the beginning just explain this left hemisphere? How did that originate in Descartes' thinking?
Yes, Descartes himself doesn't talk about left and right hemisphere, but our knowledge of brain is in its infancy in some ways, but we know there are two hemispheres, the brain. It's not the only distinction, the brain, not the only physical distinction, but there's left and right. And McGilchrist here talks about the way in which the hemispheres operate very, very differently from each other. The left, he's not pretending to be definitive on every aspect of this, but it's characteristic of the left, and he takes you through a lot of clinical evidence, characteristic of the left to be calculative, to be abstract, The left likes things to be clear-cut and certain and ordered, but the big picture is seen by the right hemisphere. And, for example, music is appreciated by the right hemisphere, and relationships by the right hemisphere. Now, McGilchrist argues pretty persuasively that the proper balance of hemispheres is that the left should be the emissary to the right. That is, the way we should operate in human life is we have these intuitions, big pictures, relationships, love, all those things. But we need also to calculate certain things, mathematically, logically, all those things. And that's where the left is indispensable, a servant to the right. Now what he says has happened, it's gone the other way around. The left is now dictating everything, so people can only see through the left hemisphere. Their view of humans is left hemispheric. And Descartes didn't operate with that knowledge of the brain, but his whole way of approaching philosophy shows that he's actually approaching life from the standpoint of just the calculative, the mechanical, for example. Does that explain? Sorry if I was too quick on riding over that.
Incidentally, I could hear you much more clearly sitting there speaking than I could when you were standing.
Liam, could you give us a quick rundown of what the brain research actually does show on the two hemispheres? Because I fear that Gilchrist was a philosopher and not a neurologist.
With respect, no, he was a qualified neuroscientist. Yeah.
Well, his conclusions go way beyond experiments.
Oh yes, he does. But I mean, he works out from his interesting qualifications. He's qualified in English literature,
yeah,
and also qualified as a psychiatrist.
Sorry, I'm putting you on the spot.
Sorry.
Have you looked in the split brain?
Yeah, off the top of my head, there's a lot of bit rusty. There's a lot of research. Most of the research is done with like split brain patients, where the corpus callosum, that's I guess a collection of axons, which are sort of like, why is it that, if you will, analogous to that connect the two hemispheres of the brain? When they're severed, you can devise some interesting experiments where you can, as they're no longer sort of connected, if you will.
This was done accidentally, I must emphasise. People have a terrible accident where a pole goes through the brain and goes through the corpus callosum, so the brain is split. Also, sometimes with very severe very severe epilepsy, in order to stop them being killed by the next epileptic stroke, they have this corpus callosum, so the signals don't go bouncing around the brain and making the fit much worse. So these are a very small number of, like a dozen patients where this has happened, and the experiments have been done on that. Yeah.
A very small number of people, I think, are also born without them, but given that, you can devise some very interesting experiments where you can, by I probably won't articulate this very well, but
So you put their head in an apparatus where there's a wall, so they can see with the right eye, they can see with the left eye. The left eye is communicating to the right side of their brain, the right eye is communicating to the left side of their brain, and one hand is controlled by each side. And interesting experiments is where the right hand picks up a cigarette and the left hand slaps it down, because the two sides are, different motivations, we found that language was more on one side than the other side, because the one side can name the object that's on the right, which is a fork, and the other side will draw the object which is on the left, which is a spoon. But neither can do the other. So it's lots of experiments like that, yeah?
But the usual criticism of McGilchrist is the other way around, that he should stick to science, that he's importing philosophy because his real competence is in psychiatry and neuroscience, not in philosophy.
No.
You're right, the evidence, his argument goes beyond the strictly scientific. That's certainly true.
Very, very interesting ideas, though. Thank you for bringing them to us.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Stephen, you have awed us.
Oh.
You've taken us beyond sanity into madness. and I hope that your view of AI is proved wrong, but you may possibly be a prophet of doom for us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David.